At 3:05 p.m. on March 15, 1917, a pen scratched across a piece of paper in a railway carriage parked on a siding near Pskov. The man holding the pen was Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia. He was signing a document that ended 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The abdication manifesto was dated and timed. It declared that he would renounce the throne in favor of his son, Alexei. But before the ink was dry, he changed his mind. He scratched out Alexei's name and wrote in that of his brother, Grand Duke Michael. At that moment, the fate of a vast empire shifted. The train sat still. The generals stood silent. Outside, the February Revolution was already underway in Petrograd, but inside that carriage, a dynasty was being erased by a single signature. No one yet knew what would follow. What happened? The Russian Empire in 1917 covered 1/6 of the world's land surface. It stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It contained more than 160 million people, speaking dozens of languages and practicing many faiths. At the head of this massive state stood one man, Nicholas II, who had inherited the throne in 1894. He believed sincerely and absolutely in his God-given right to rule. He called himself the autocrat of all the Russias. He was not a cruel man. He was a weak man. He was indecisive, stubborn, and deeply attached to his family. His wife, Alexandra, was German-born and deeply religious. Their only son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a blood disorder that could kill him from a simple bruise. The Tsarina, desperate for a cure, fell under the influence of a Siberian mystic named Grigory Rasputin. That influence would corrode the monarchy's reputation beyond repair. The first cracks appeared in 1905. On January 22nd of that year, a peaceful procession of workers and their families marched toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They carried icons and portraits of the Tsar. They believed he would hear their grievances. They wanted better wages, shorter hours, and an end to the Russo-Japanese War. The guards ordered them to stop. The crowd kept moving. At 2 p.m., rifle fire erupted. Hundreds of people fell dead or wounded in the snow. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. The Tsar, who was not at the palace, expressed regret but did not change his policies. The trust that had held the monarchy together for centuries was shattered. Strikes and uprisings swept the empire. Nicholas was forced to issue the October Manifesto, which created an elected parliament called the Duma. But he never intended to share real power. He dissolved the first Duma after 73 days. He did the same to the second. The third and fourth Duma were more compliant, but the people saw that the Tsar's promises were hollow. By 1914, the empire was simmering. Then came the Great War. Russia entered World War I in August of that year, partly to defend its ally Serbia against Austria-Hungary. The war was a disaster from the start. The Russian army was poorly equipped, badly led, and massively outgunned. In the first year alone, over 1 million soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Tsar made a catastrophic decision in 1905. He went to the front to personally command the army. This left the government in the hands of the Tsarina and Rasputin. At the time, Rasputin was already known as a drunken debaucher who openly interfered in state appointments. Ministers were appointed and dismissed based on his whims. The Duma was sidelined. The economy began to collapse. Food shortages hit the cities. In Petrograd, the capital, bread queues grew longer and tempers shorter. By the winter of 1916, the mood was explosive. On December 30th, 1916, a group of nobles and conservative politicians assassinated Rasputin. They hoped to save the monarchy by removing its most toxic influence. It did not work. The damage was done. The Tsarina was increasingly isolated and hysterical. The Tsar remained at the front, out of touch. The bureaucracy was paralyzed. By February 1917, the temperature in Petrograd dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Fuel was scarce. Bread was rationed. On February 23rd, International Women's Day, thousands of female textile workers took to the streets to demand bread and peace. They were joined by workers from other factories. By the end of the day, over 70,000 people were marching. The police tried to disperse them. They failed. The next day, the strike grew. The day after that, it became a general strike. The entire city of Petrograd shut down. On February 26, the Tsar sent a telegram from the front ordering the army to suppress the unrest by force. Soldiers of the Petrograd garrison were ordered to fire on crowds. Some obeyed. But the next day, February 27, the soldiers of the Volinsky regiment mutinied. They refused to shoot civilians. They turned their rifles on their own officers. Within hours, the mutiny spread to other regiments. The arsenal was seized. The prisons were opened. The Duma, which the Tsar had prorogued, met anyway. A provisional committee was formed. The revolution had become irreversible. The Tsar, still at the front, tried to return to Petrograd by train. His train was diverted. He was stranded in Pskov, the headquarters of the Northern Front. There, on March 15th, he received a delegation of generals and Duma members. They told him the situation was hopeless. The only way to avoid a civil war was for him to abdicate. He initially refused. Then he agreed. He signed the manifesto, then changed his air. When he finished, he wrote in his diary, "All around me is treachery, cowardice, and deceit." The grand experiment of autocracy ended not with a battle, but with a pen and a train. But the abdication did not solve the empire's problems. Grand Duke Michael refused the throne, effectively ending the monarchy. Power passed to the provisional government, a body of liberal politicians and industrialists who promised to hold elections and continue the war. They were weak from the start. They had to share authority with the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers that represented the revolutionary masses. The Soviet issued Order No. 1, which declared that soldiers should obey only the Soviet, not the provisional government. The army began to disintegrate. How could this have happened? How did a dynasty that had ruled for 300 years collapse in a matter of days? The answers lie in a chain of failures that stretch back decades. The first failure was economic. Russia industrialized late and unevenly. The majority of the population were peasants living in abject poverty. Land ownership was concentrated in the hands of the nobility and the church. The industrial workers who flooded the cities were housed in overcrowded slums and worked 16-hour days for starvation wages. The Tsar's government did little to address these conditions. Instead, it relied on repression. The secret police, the Okhrana, monitored dissent. Censorship was heavy. Exile to Siberia was common. This created a deep reservoir of resentment. The second failure was political. The Tsar refused to share power. Even after 1905, he resisted constitutional government. He appointed and dismissed prime ministers at will. He packed the Duma with loyalists. He disbanded it when it disagreed with him. The result was that when the crisis came, there was no legitimate channel for reform. The only option left was revolution. The third failure was military. World War I exposed every weakness of the empire. The railways could not supply the front. The soldiers fought without rifles. The generals were incompetent. The Tsar's decision to take personal command meant that every defeat was laid at his feet. By 1917, the army was exhausted, demoralized, and ready to turn on its commanders. The fourth failure was personal. Nicholas II was not a tyrant. He was a devoted husband and father. But he was also utterly convinced that his authority came from God and that surrendering any of it would betray his sacred duty. He could not adapt. He could not compromise. When the crisis arrived, he had no allies left. The nobility despised him because of Rasputin. The generals abandoned him because the war was lost. The people had stopped believing in him years before. He stood alone in a railway carriage, signing away an empire. The last failure was informational. The Tsar received consistently distorted reports from Petrograd. His ministers told him the unrest was minor, that the soldiers were loyal, that a show of force would restore order. He believed them. By the time he understood the truth, it was too late. The revolution had already won. The Russian Empire was not brought down by a single event. It was brought down by decades of accumulated mistakes, missed opportunities, and unrealized reforms. The abdication of Nicholas II was the final punctuation mark on a long, tragic paragraph. But the story did not end there. The provisional government would fall in 8 months. A new power would rise, one that would change the world. That part comes later. For now, the empire is gone. The Tsar is under house arrest. The question of what comes next hangs in the frozen air. At 11:10 p.m. on April 16, 1917, a train pulled into the Finland station in Petrograd. It had traveled from Zurich through Germany, Sweden, and Finland in a sealed carriage. The man who stepped onto the platform was Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. He had been in exile for nearly a decade. He was met by a small crowd of supporters, workers, and soldiers. He gave an impromptu speech that lasted only a few minutes. He called for the overthrow of the provisional government and for an immediate end to the war. He did not pause. He did not soften his words. The provisional government had hoped that allowing Lenin's passage through Germany would somehow discredit him in the eyes of the public. Instead, he returned as a prophet of revolution. What happened next reshaped the course of the 20th century. Lenin immediately published his April Theses, a set of demands that rejected any cooperation with the provisional government, called for all power to the Soviets, and demanded an immediate end to the war. He argued that the bourgeois revolution was over and that the working class must now seize power. His party was small, with perhaps 25,000 members nationwide. His ideas seemed extreme, even to many socialists. The other socialist parties, the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries, dominated the Petrograd Soviet and favored a coalition with the provisional government. Lenin was isolated, but he had two things working in his favor. The war was still grinding on, and the provisional government was getting weaker by the day. By May, the provisional government had failed to secure food deliveries, control inflation, or reduce casualties at the front. The Minister of War, Alexander Kerensky, launched a new offensive in June 1917, hoping to revive Russian morale and pressure the Allies. The offensive began on July 1st. It started well, but within a week the German and Austrian armies counterattacked. The Russian army disintegrated. Whole units fled. Others refused to fight. Some soldiers turned on their officers. Casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. The news reached Petrograd just as the temperature of the city reached its summertime peak. On July 16th, spontaneous demonstrations erupted in Petrograd. Workers and soldiers marched to the Tauride Palace, the seat of the Soviet, demanding that the Soviet take power. The Bolsheviks were caught off guard, but they quickly tried to channel the anger into a coordinated uprising. It failed. The provisional government brought in loyal troops and suppressed the protests. Lenin fled to Finland. Several Bolshevik leaders were arrested. The party was declared illegal and its newspaper, Pravda, was shut down. It seemed as though the Bolshevik movement had been crushed, but the cracks in the provisional government were deeper than they appeared. Kerensky, now prime minister, faced a collapsing economy and a restless army. The generals, led by General Lavr Kornilov, demanded a crackdown. They wanted to restore order, crush the Soviets, and continue the war. Kerensky feared Kornilov's ambition. In August, Kornilov marched his troops toward Petrograd with the declared intention of saving the country. Did he intend a military takeover? The evidence is still debated. Kerensky panicked. He appealed to the Bolsheviks for help. He released their leaders from prison, legalized their party, and distributed weapons to the Red Guards, the workers' militia controlled by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks organized the defense of Petrograd. Rail lines were sabotaged. Propaganda was sent to Kornilov's soldiers. Within days, Kornilov's march stalled. His troops refused to fight. He was arrested. The coup collapsed. But the damage to Kerensky was fatal. He had armed the Bolsheviks and they had no intention of disarming. By September, the Bolsheviks held a majority in the Petrograd Soviet. Their leader, Leon Trotsky, became chairman of the Soviet's Military Revolutionary Committee. He began to plan an insurrection. Lenin, still in hiding in Finland, wrote frantic letters demanding that the seizure of power happen immediately. He returned to Petrograd in early October and argued before the Central Committee that the time had come. The committee narrowly voted in favor. The date was set, November 7, 1917, according to the Gregorian calendar. In the old Russian calendar, it was October 25th. That is why it is called the October Revolution. How could a small, outlawed party seize power in one of the largest empires in the world? The answer lies in a series of systemic failures. The provisional government had no popular mandate. It postponed elections. It insisted on continuing the war. It failed to address land reform. The army was no longer reliable. The Soviets, the councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants, held the real power in many cities and regions. The Bolsheviks simply took control of the institutions that already existed. They were ruthless, disciplined, and organized. And they had a simple, compelling message: peace, land, bread. On the night of November 6, 1917, Red Guards and soldiers loyal to the Bolsheviks began to seize key positions in Petrograd. They occupied the telegraph office, the railway stations, the bridges, and the power plant. By dawn, the only stronghold left was the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was meeting. At 10 a.m. on November 7th, Lenin issued a proclamation declaring the government overthrown. By 2 p.m., the palace was surrounded. At 9 p.m., the cruiser Aurora, anchored on the Neva River, fired a blank shot as a signal to storm the palace. The commitment was almost bloodless. The defenders inside, mostly cadets and a women's battalion, put up little resistance. By 2 a.m. on November 8th, the members of the provisional government were under arrest. Kerensky had escaped hours earlier and fled to the front, but no one followed him. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets was meeting at that very moment in the Smolny Institute. When the Bolsheviks announced the fall of the Winter Palace, the Congress approved the transfer of power to the Soviets. Lenin appeared on the stage, exhausted but triumphant. He read the decree on peace, which called for an immediate end to the war. Then he read the decree on land, which abolished private ownership of land and turned it over to peasant committees. The crowd cheered. The Bolsheviks had won, but winning power was one thing, holding it was another. The new government, now called the Council of People's Commissars, faced a country in chaos. The war continued, though the army had largely dissolved. Peasants began seizing land on their own, often violently. Factory workers took control of their workplaces. National minorities from Finland to Ukraine declared independence. The Bolsheviks had no control over the countryside. They had no experience governing. They had no money. The banks were on strike. The civil service refused to cooperate. The first months of Bolshevik rule were a scramble just to keep the capital fed and heated. But Lenin was determined. He ordered the closure of the Constituent Assembly, the long-awaited elected parliament, after it met for only one day in January 1909. The Bolsheviks had won only a minority of the seats, but they refused to share power. The Cheka, the secret police, was established to root out opponents. Political parties were banned. Press freedom was abolished. The new regime was not democratic. It was a dictatorship of the proletariat, as Lenin called it, but in practice, it was a dictatorship of the Bolshevik Party. In March 1918, the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. Russia lost Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, Ukraine, and parts of the Caucasus. The empire that had taken centuries to build was carved up. The treaty was humiliating, but it gave the Bolsheviks a breathing space. They moved the capital from Petrograd to Moscow, farther from the German front. They began to consolidate control. Then came the Civil War. Opponents of the Bolsheviks, known as the Whites, gathered under the leadership of former Tsarist generals. They received support from Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, who feared the spread of revolution and wanted to reopen the Eastern Front against Germany. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and spread across vast territories. The Bolsheviks, now called the Reds, were outnumbered, but they held the center, controlled the railways, and had a unified command under Trotsky. Trotsky built a new army from scratch, using old Tsarist officers under the watch of political commissars. The war would last 3 years, cost millions of lives, and leave the country devastated. Meanwhile, the former Tsar and his family remained under house arrest, first at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, then in Tobolsk, deep in Siberia. In April 1918, as the Whites advanced, the Bolsheviks moved the Romanovs to Yekaterinburg, a city in the Ural Mountains. They were held in the Ipatiev house, a merchant's mansion. Conditions were harsh. The family lived in a few rooms under constant guard. The Bolsheviks feared that the Whites might rescue the Tsar and use him as a symbolic figurehead. On the night of July 16, 1918, the local Bolshevik authorities received a coded telegram from Moscow. It was an order to execute the entire family. At midnight on July 17th, the family was woken and told to dress. They were led down to the basement on the pretext of being moved. Once they were assembled, Yakov Yurovsky, the head of the execution detail, read a brief statement. The Ural Soviet had condemned them to death. Nicholas turned to ask what was happening, but Yurovsky raised his revolver and shot him in the chest. The other guards opened fire on the family and servants. It was chaotic. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and taken to a nearby mine shaft where they were mutilated, burned, and buried in a shallow grave. They were not discovered for decades. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 304 years, ended in a basement in Yekaterinburg. How could this happen? The execution was not part of a grand plan. It was a local decision carried out with Moscow's cautious approval. The Bolsheviks did not want the Tsar to fall into enemy hands. They also wanted to send a message. There would be no return to the old order. The monarchy was dead, literally and symbolically. The act was brutal, secretive, and final. It marked the moment when the revolution turned from the overthrow of a regime into the construction of a new one, built on terror. The Civil War continued for another 3 years. By 1921, the Reds had defeated the Whites, but the cost was staggering. The war, combined with food shortages, a severe drought, and the Bolshevik policy of war communism, led to a famine that killed an estimated 5 million people. The economy collapsed. Industrial production fell to a fraction of what it had been in 1904. The population of Petrograd dropped from 2.5 million to less than 700,000. People fled the cities, returned to the countryside, and tried to survive. The Russian Empire was gone, but its successor state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was born in 1920. It would last for 70 years. The question that remains is whether the revolution was inevitable. The empire had failed. The war had destroyed it. The monarchy had lost its legitimacy. But there were other paths. The provisional government could have made peace, distributed land, and held early elections. The moderate socialists could have taken power in the spring of 1907. The Whites could have won the Civil War. None of those things happened. What did happen was a revolution driven not by a single cause but by a cascade of failures, each one compounding the last. The Russian Empire fell because it could not adapt, because it chose repression over reform, because it stumbled into a war it could not win, and because when the moment came, no one was willing to defend it. The empire is gone. The Tsar is dead. The winter air over Petrograd in 1917 held the question of what comes next. By 1922, that question had been answered. A new empire, ideological and totalitarian, was rising from the ashes. It would be more powerful, more ruthless, and longer lasting. But that is a story for another part of the night. For now, the snow covers the old world. The new one has not yet shown its face. At 10:40 in the morning of January 21, 1924, a train pulled into the Pavletsky station in Moscow. It carried the body of Vladimir Lenin, who had died a few hours earlier at his estate in Gorky, about 25 miles south of the capital. The cause of death was a massive stroke, the third one he had suffered in less than 2 years. He was 53 years old. The country had known he was ill, but the official announcement still sent a shock through every level of society. Over the next 4 days, an estimated 1 million people filed past his open coffin in the Hall of Columns in central Moscow. The temperature outside fell to minus 30 degrees Celsius, yet the line stretched for miles. People waited hours in the cold, many weeping, others simply staring. On January 27th, the body was placed in a temporary wooden mausoleum on Red Square, where it would later be embalmed and preserved for permanent display. The question that hung over the entire event was not whether Lenin would be remembered, but who would take his place. The struggle for succession began long before Lenin died. In fact, it had been brewing since May 1922, when Lenin suffered his first stroke and was forced to reduce his workload. He had no clear heir, and the party leadership was divided. The two most prominent figures were Leon Trotsky, the brilliant organizer of the Red Army, and Joseph Stalin, the general secretary of the Communist Party. There were others: Lev Kamenev, Grigory Zinoviev, Nikolai Bukharin, but the fight would narrow to Trotsky and Stalin. Lenin himself had written a testament in December 1922 warning against Stalin's concentration of power, calling him too rude, and suggesting he be removed from his post. But Lenin's health continued to decline, and the testament was never read aloud to the full party Congress. Instead, it was suppressed by Stalin's allies. By the time Lenin died, Stalin had already positioned himself as the keeper of the orthodoxy, a master of the bureaucracy, and the controller of appointments. Within a few years, he would have absolute power, but in 1924, no one could have predicted just how absolute that power would become. Under Lenin's leadership, the Bolsheviks had made one crucial concession to reality. In March 1921, faced with peasant uprisings, factory strikes, and a mutiny by sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, Lenin introduced the New Economic Policy, or NEP. It was a retreat from pure communism. Instead of forced grain requisitions and total state control of industry, the NEP allowed peasants to sell surplus grain on the open market and small businesses to operate privately. Heavy industry, banking, and foreign trade remained under state ownership, but the NEP brought a measure of economic stability. Hunger receded, shops reopened, the black market faded. By 1925, industrial output had climbed back to nearly 80% of pre-war levels. Grain production recovered. The country began to breathe again. But the NEP also created a new class of prosperous peasants called kulaks, and a layer of private traders known as netmen. To many Bolsheviks, this was a betrayal of the revolution. They had not overthrown the Tsar only to watch a new bourgeoisie emerge. The debate over the NEP would define the politics of the one night with zeros. Stalin initially supported the NEP as a pragmatic measure. He was not a theoretician like Trotsky or Bukharin, but he was a patient tactician. He formed alliances with the right wing of the party, led by Bukharin, to isolate Trotsky, who called for rapid industrialization and collectivization. In 1925, Trotsky was removed from his post as war commissar. In 1927, he was expelled from the party. In 1929, he was exiled from the Soviet Union entirely. He ended up in Mexico City, where in 1940 he would be assassinated with an ice axe by a Soviet agent. But before that, one by one, all of Stalin's rivals fell. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had briefly allied with Trotsky, were expelled and later executed in the Great Purges of the 193s. Bukharin, once Stalin's closest ally, was tried, convicted, and shot in 1938. By the end of the decade, Stalin was the sole ruler of the Soviet Union, a dictator with no checks on his power. What happened in between was a transformation so rapid and brutal that it changed the course of the 20th century. In 1928, Stalin abandoned the NEP and launched the first five-year plan. The goal was to modernize the Soviet Union within a decade, to catch up with the industrialized West, to create a military capable of defending the revolution, and to build a socialist economy from scratch. The plan set impossibly high targets for coal, steel, electricity, machine tools, and armaments. But the central element was collectivization, the forced consolidation of individual peasant farms into large state-controlled collective farms. It was the largest social engineering project in history, and it was carried out with almost no regard for human life. By the end of 1929, the state was sending armed detachments into the countryside to seize grain and force peasants into collectives. Anyone who resisted was labeled a kulak and deported to remote labor camps in Siberia, the Arctic, or Central Asia. Between 1930 and 1933, an estimated 5 million peasants were arrested, relocated, or executed. The deportations were chaotic. Families were packed into unheated railway cars. Many died of exposure or starvation before reaching their destinations. Those who remained on the land were left without draft animals, tools, or grain for the next planting. In some regions, the peasants slaughtered their livestock rather than hand them over to the state. The total loss of cattle, horses, sheep, and pigs ran into the tens of millions. The result was catastrophic. From 1930 to 1933, a severe famine swept across the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, the North Caucasus, the Volga region, and Kazakhstan. Millions starved to death. The precise death toll remains disputed, but most historians estimate that between 5 and 7 million people died in the Soviet famine of 1932-1933. In Ukraine, where the famine was most severe, it is often referred to as the Holodomor, a deliberate act of genocide by the Soviet state. The famine was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe caused by the state's seizure of grain reserves, its refusal to distribute emergency food aid, and its militarized extraction policies. In many villages, the authorities blocked all movement, preventing starving peasants from seeking food elsewhere. The state continued to export grain for hard currency to pay for imported machinery and industrial equipment. People died in fields, in their homes, on roads. Cannibalism was reported. The scale of suffering was vast, but the central government refused to acknowledge it. Stalin's official position was that the famine did not exist. When foreign journalists tried to report it, they were expelled. When local officials reported the death toll, they were purged. The Soviet Union was being transformed into an industrial power, but the cost was being paid in human lives. Meanwhile, the industrial targets of the 5-year plans were met and sometimes exceeded. In 1928, the Soviet Union produced about 4 million tons of steel. By 1932, that figure had risen to nearly 6 million tons. Coal production doubled. Electricity generation tripled. New industrial cities sprang up in the Urals, Siberia, and Kazakhstan. Magnitogorsk, built from nothing in the southern Urals, became the largest steel plant in the world. Dnipro-HES, a giant hydroelectric dam on the Dnieper River, was completed in 1993. The Moscow Metro, a showcase of Soviet engineering, opened in 1935. The workforce was drawn from the countryside, often through coercion. Millions of peasants were recruited into the factories, housed in cramped barracks, and subjected to strict labor discipline. The working conditions were harsh, but the industrial output allowed the Soviet Union to build a modern military. By 1937, it had become the second largest industrial power in the world, behind only the United States. But the industrial and agricultural transformation was accompanied by a political terror that reached every corner of Soviet society. In December 1934, Sergei Kirov, the party boss in Leningrad and a popular figure, was assassinated. Stalin used the murder as a pretext to launch a massive wave of repression. Over the next 4 years, known as the Great Purge, the secret police arrested, tortured, and executed millions of people. The targets included old Bolsheviks, military officers, intellectuals, engineers, and ordinary citizens suspected of disloyalty. The show Trials of 1936 to 1938 featured former leaders like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, who confessed to fabricated charges of plotting with Trotsky and foreign intelligence agencies. They were convicted and shot. The Red Army High Command was decimated. 3 of 5 marshals were executed. Nearly all the commanders of military districts were purged. The officer corps was purged of about 35,000 men. The terror spread to every ministry, every factory, every collective farm. The secret police, now called the NKVD, operated with no legal restraints. People disappeared in the night. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents. The Gulag system, a network of forced labor camps, expanded and swallowed millions of prisoners, many of whom died from cold, malnutrition, or exhaustion. How could this happen? The Great Purge had multiple functions. It eliminated any potential opposition to Stalin, real or imagined. It reinforced his personal dictatorship. It also created a climate of fear that paralyzed independent thought and ensured total obedience. The party, the state, the army, and the secret police became extensions of Stalin's will. The revolution that had promised liberation from oppression had produced a system of oppression more thorough than anything seen under the Tsars. The question of why the Soviet people submitted is complex, but part of the answer lies in the combination of genuine belief, fear, and a society that had already been shattered by war, revolution, civil war, famine, and forced industrialization. There was no organized resistance left. By 1939, Stalin stood at the helm of a transformed nation. The Soviet Union was an industrial giant, a military powerhouse, and a totalitarian state. The Russian Empire had been replaced by a new empire, one that controlled the same territory and many of the same peoples, but was driven by an ideology of class warfare and state ownership. The revolution had not ended in 1919. It had continued, deepened, and turned inward. The dream of a classless society had been replaced by the reality of a ruling class of party officials, secret police chiefs, and factory managers. The violence did not end. It only changed shape. And beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, the world was heading toward another war, one that would test the new empire to its limits. On August 23, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed in Moscow. It was a non-aggression treaty between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, which included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Stalin hoped it would buy time and territory. On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland was partitioned. In November, the Soviet Union attacked Finland in the Winter War, a brutal conflict that exposed weaknesses in the Red Army. But Stalin was not deterred. He had built a dictatorship on the foundation of the revolution. The Tsars were gone. The revolutionaries were being killed. The only thing left was power itself. The story of the Russian Empire did not end with the Romanovs. It continued in the shape of the Soviet Union, a state that would define the 20th century, fight the largest war in history, build the first space satellite, and eventually collapse under its own contradictions. But that is further ahead. For now, the winter of 1939 settled over Moscow. The snow fell on Red Square. The mausoleum held the embalmed body of Lenin. The party ruled. The people waited. The revolution was complete, but the future was being written in blood. At 3:15 a.m. on the 22nd of June 1941, the German army launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, crossed into Soviet territory along a frontier stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The attack came without a formal declaration of war. The Soviet border guards were overwhelmed. Entire divisions were destroyed in the first hours. Airfields were bombed. Communication lines were cut. Within days, the German forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers. The Red Army, still recovering from the purges of the late 1930s, was unprepared for the scale and speed of the assault. Stalin, who had received numerous intelligence reports warning of an imminent German attack, refused to believe them. He ordered his commanders not to provoke the Germans. That order left Soviet troops in a defensive posture that quickly turned into a rout. What happened in the first weeks of the invasion was a disaster of near-total collapse. The German armies encircled and destroyed entire Soviet army groups. By the end of September, over 2 million Soviet soldiers had been captured. The Germans had reached the outskirts of Leningrad in the north, captured Kiev in the south, and were advancing on Moscow in the center. The the Soviet government began a desperate evacuation of industrial plants and machinery from the western regions to the east, beyond the Urals. Entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains and reassembled in cities like Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, and Sverdlovsk. Workers lived in makeshift barracks and worked 16-hour shifts to restart production. The Soviet Union was fighting for its survival, but the resistance, though chaotic, was not passive. Behind the front lines, partisans began to operate. The vast distances and harsh terrain slowed the German advance. The Russian winter, which began early in 1941, brought the German offensive to a halt just short of Moscow. How could the Soviet Union survive such a blow? The answer lies partly in the nature of the state that had been built under Stalin. The Soviet system was centralized, ruthless, and capable of mobilizing enormous resources. The same terror that had purged the army also ensured that no one dared to refuse orders. The country's industrial capacity, relocated and rebuilt, eventually outproduced Germany. The human cost was staggering, but the system did not break. By December 1941, a Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. It was the first major defeat of the German army since the beginning of the war. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The war was far from over, but the Soviet Union had proven that it could fight and bleed the invader. The next 3 years saw some of the most brutal battles in human history. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days. Over 1 million civilians died from starvation, cold, and bombing. The city was cut off from food supplies, and the only link to the outside world was a road across the frozen Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life. In early 1942, the German army launched a new offensive aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Stalingrad became a grinding urban battle where every building, every street, every sewer was contested. The fighting was house to house, room to room. Soldiers on both sides suffered extreme casualties. The Soviet defenders, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, adopted a tactic of close combat to nullify German air and artillery superiority. By November 1942, a Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, encircled the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. The German commander, Friedrich Paulus, was ordered by Hitler to hold his position and not attempt a breakout. After months of encirclement, with no food, ammunition, or medical supplies, the German forces surrendered in February 1943. Over 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, most of whom would never return home. Stalingrad was a turning point. From that moment on, the Red Army seized the strategic initiative and began a slow, grinding advance westward. The war continued for another 2 years. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 was the largest tank battle in history. The Red Army, by then better equipped and led by experienced commanders, blunted the German offensive and then launched its own counterattack. From 1943 to 1945, the Soviet forces pushed the Germans back through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and into Germany itself. Along the way, they liberated concentration camps and death camps. They saw the evidence of the Holocaust. The Red Army reached Berlin in April 1945. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. On May 8th, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The Soviet Union had paid an unimaginable price. At least 27 million Soviet citizens died during the war, more than any other country. Millions more were wounded or displaced. The country's infrastructure lay in ruins. Hundreds of cities and tens of thousands of villages had been destroyed. But the Soviet Union emerged from the war as a superpower. The Red Army occupied most of Eastern Europe, and Stalin imposed communist governments in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The Soviet Union had been transformed from a revolutionary state, isolated and threatened, into a global empire that rivaled the United States. What did this mean for the people who lived within the Soviet borders? The war had created a new sense of national pride, but it had also reinforced the power of the state. Stalin's authority was absolute. The war had been fought not only against the Germans but also against internal dissent. After the war, the repression continued. Former prisoners of war were sent to the Gulag because they had been captured. Suspected collaborators were executed or imprisoned. The Soviet system did not soften, it hardened. The terror resumed, though on a smaller scale than the Great Purge. The cult of Stalin grew. He was portrayed as the great leader who had saved the country. But beneath the propaganda, the country was exhausted, impoverished, and deeply scarred. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died. His death brought a period of uncertainty. The power struggle that followed eventually led to Nikita Khrushchev, a man who had been a loyal Stalinist but who now saw the need for change. In 1956, at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, Khrushchev delivered a secret speech, later known as the Secret Speech, in which he denounced Stalin's cult of personality and his crimes. He spoke of the purges, the torture, the executions. He did not, however, criticize the system itself. He blamed Stalin's personal failings. The speech shocked the party and the world. It led to a limited thaw, a period of relative openness in culture and politics. Writers were allowed to publish work that had been banned. Prisoners in the Gulag were released, but the thaw was limited. When Hungary attempted to break away from Soviet control later that same year, Khrushchev ordered the Red Army to crush the uprising. The Soviet Union was not willing to let its empire unravel. The decades that followed, known as the Brezhnev era, were a time of stagnation. The economy, which had grown rapidly under Stalin and Khrushchev, began to slow. Heavy industry and military spending took priority over consumer goods. Living standards stagnated. The black market grew. The system became increasingly corrupt. The party elite, the nomenklatura, enjoyed privileges that ordinary citizens could not dream of, but dissent was still suppressed. Dissidents like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote about the Gulag, were arrested or exiled. The war in Afghanistan, which began in 1979, drained resources and morale. The Soviet Union seemed to be a superpower, but its foundations were crumbling. How could a system that had survived war, famine, and terror eventually collapse? The answer is complex, but part of it lies in the very contradictions of the revolution itself. The Soviet Union had been built on the promise of equality, but it had produced a new class of rulers. It had promised liberation from oppression, but it had created a police state. It had promised a future of abundance, but it had delivered shortages. By the 1980s, a new generation of leaders, headed by Mikhail Gorbachev, recognized that the system needed reform. Gorbachev introduced glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. His goal was to improve the system, not to destroy it. But the reforms opened a floodgate. Long-suppressed nationalist movements in the republics demanded independence. The economy, already in decline, fell into crisis. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 exposed the failures of the state to protect its citizens. The people began to question whether the system was worth preserving. The final act began in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. One by one, the communist governments of Eastern Europe crumbled. The Soviet Union itself began to fracture. In 1991, a coup by hardline communists failed. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, emerged as the leader of the opposition. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union was dissolved. The empire that had replaced the Russian Empire was gone. What remains today is a legacy of contradictions. The Russian Empire, with its czars and serfs, its grandeur and brutality, gave way to a revolution that promised a new world. That revolution, in turn, gave way to a Soviet state that was both a superpower and a prison. The Soviet Union collapsed, and Russia emerged again, but not as the empire of old. The cycle of empire and revolution, of violence and transformation, continues to shape the country and the world. The story of the Russian Empire does not end with the Romanovs. It does not end with the Soviet Union. It is a story still being written, one that reminds us that history, even when it seems to sleep, never really rests. At 10 in the morning on the 4th of October 1993, the Russian White House in Moscow erupted in flames. Tank shells slammed into the building, floor by floor, while smoke poured from shattered windows. Inside were hundreds of parliamentarians, deputies, and armed supporters who had barricaded themselves against President Boris Yeltsin's decree dissolving the Supreme Soviet. The standoff had been building for weeks. On September 21st, Yeltsin had issued a decree ordering new parliamentary elections. The parliament responded by declaring Yeltsin's actions unconstitutional and appointing Alexander Rutska as acting president. Two rival governments claimed legitimacy. The Constitutional Court sided with the parliament. The military at first stayed neutral. Then, on October 3rd, armed supporters of the parliament stormed the Moscow mayor's office and tried to seize the Ostankino television center. The fighting left dozens dead. The next morning, Yeltsin ordered the army to retake the White House by force. By late afternoon, the building was surrendered. Over 150 people were dead. The event marked the end of Russia's brief experiment with parliamentary democracy. What happened? The crisis was not a simple power struggle. It was the violent unraveling of the system inherited from the Soviet collapse. When the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, Russia inherited a confused blend of Soviet-era institutions and new democratic structures. The president had been given strong executive powers, but the parliament, the Supreme Soviet, retained control over the budget, legislation, and the constitution. The two branches were locked in a zero-sum conflict. Yeltsin, elected president in 1991 with a mandate for reform, pushed ahead with shock therapy, price liberalization, mass privatization, and deep cuts in state spending. The results were catastrophic for ordinary Russians. Inflation erased savings, factories closed, unemployment soared. A new class of oligarchs emerged, buying up state assets for pennies. The parliament, dominated by former communists and nationalists, blocked further reforms. Yeltsin's response was to bypass the legislature, rule by decree, and eventually dissolve it. The parliament refused to go quietly. The standoff escalated into open confrontation. How could this have happened? The Constitution of the Russian Federation, drafted in haste after the Soviet collapse, did not clearly define the separation of powers. It was a hybrid document designed to calm competing factions, but it created a system where the president and the parliament could both claim authority. There was no mechanism to resolve a deadlock. The Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, and the military all had conflicting loyalties. When the crisis reached its peak, Yeltsin's decision to use military force was not a last resort. It was a calculated gamble. He knew that the army, demoralized and underfunded, would follow orders if the alternative was chaos. The parliament, for its part, believed that popular support would protect them. They miscalculated. The Russian people, exhausted by economic collapse and political instability, did not rise up to defend the parliament. They stayed home. The tanks rolled. The old Soviet parliament building, which had been the seat of the Russian Republic's legislature since 1981, was left gutted and scarred. The aftermath of the 1993 crisis reshaped Russian politics. Yeltsin pushed through a new constitution by referendum in December 1993. That constitution concentrated power in the presidency. The president could appoint the prime minister, dissolve the Duma, issue decrees, and veto legislation. The parliament was weakened, reduced to a rubber stamp. The Constitutional Court lost its power to review presidential decrees. Russia became what political scientists call a super-presidential system. The checks and balances that democracy requires were stripped away. The 1993 Constitution remains in force today. It is the foundation upon which Vladimir Putin later built his authoritarian regime. But the 1993 crisis was only one failure among many. The 1990s in Russia were a decade of humiliation, poverty, and violence. The state was weak. The economy was in freefall. The military was unable to maintain order. In 1994, Yeltsin ordered a full-scale invasion of Chechnya, a republic in the Caucasus that had declared independence after the Soviet collapse. The First Chechen War was a disaster. The Russian army, poorly trained and low on morale, was ambushed in the streets of Grozny. Hundreds of Russian soldiers were killed in the first weeks. The war dragged on for 2 years, costing tens of thousands of lives. The Russian public saw the war on television, body bags, burning tanks, refugee columns. The government's response was to clamp down on independent media. The war ended in a humiliating ceasefire in 1996, leaving Chechnya effectively independent. The Russian state, once the master of a global empire, could not even control its own territory. What did these failures mean for the Russian people? The 190s were a time of deep disillusionment. The grand promises of the 1991 revolution, democracy, prosperity, freedom, had turned into a nightmare. The average Russian saw their standard of living collapse. Life expectancy, especially for men, dropped sharply. Alcoholism, suicide, and crime soared. The state could not pay pensions or wages on time. Hospitals lacked medicines. Schools lacked heat. Meanwhile, a tiny group of oligarchs, Boris Berezovsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Vladimir Putin, and others, amassed enormous fortunes by looting state assets. They bought up oil companies, banks, and media outlets. They controlled the economy and, through their wealth, influenced politics. The state became a vehicle for private enrichment. The public's trust in democratic institutions evaporated. By the late 190s, Yeltsin's health was failing. He was frequently drunk in public. His approval ratings were in the single digits. The country was drifting toward another crisis. In 1998, Russia defaulted on its domestic debt, triggering a financial collapse. The ruble lost 3/4 of its value. Banks failed. Imports vanished. Again, ordinary Russians bore the brunt. The government was paralyzed. Yeltsin changed prime ministers almost every year, trying to find someone who could manage the chaos. None succeeded. Then, on the 31st of December 1999, Yeltsin made a surprise televised address. He announced his resignation, effective immediately. He appointed a little-known former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin as acting president. The message was clear. The era of reform was over. The state needed a firm hand. Putin's first major action was to launch the Second Chechen War in the autumn of 1999. A series of apartment bombings in Moscow and other cities, blamed on Chechen terrorists, killed nearly 300 people. The public was terrified. The government responded with a full-scale military campaign, and this time the Russian army performed better. Grozny was bombed into rubble. Chechen fighters were driven into the mountains. The war was brutal and civilian casualties were high, but Russian forces achieved a military victory. Putin's approval rating soared. He was seen as a strong leader who could restore order. What systems failed in the 190s? Almost all of them. The judicial system was corrupt and ineffective. Law enforcement was underfunded and often complicit in crime. The tax system was dysfunctional. The military had been gutted by budget cuts. The social safety net had collapsed. The press was nominally free but increasingly controlled by oligarchs who used their media outlets as weapons in political feuds. The government's own institutions were riddled with corruption. When Yeltsin resigned, the state was a shell. Putin inherited a country that was sick, poor, and humiliated. His task was not just to govern, but to rebuild the state itself. Putin's first term, from 2000 to 2004, focused on reasserting central authority. He brought the oligarchs to heel, forcing them to sell their media assets or face prosecution. Berezovsky fled to exile. Khodorkovsky was arrested and sent to prison on tax evasion charges that were widely seen as political. The regional governors, who had become semi-independent barons under Yeltsin, were stripped of their power. The Duma, now dominated by a new pro-Putin party called United Russia, passed laws that tightened control over the media, the judiciary, and civil society. The economy, buoyed by rising oil prices, began to recover. By 2005, the Russian state was solvent again. Life expectancy rose. Poverty declined. For many Russians, Putin's rule represented stability and predictability after the chaos of the 1990s, but the cost was high. The democratic institutions that had been built in the early 1990s were dismantled or hollowed out. Elections became tightly controlled. The opposition was marginalized. Independent television stations were shut down. Journalists who investigated corruption or human rights abuses were attacked, jailed, or killed. The most famous case was Anna Politkovskaya, a journalist who reported on the Chechen War. She was shot dead in her apartment building in Moscow in 2006. No one was ever held accountable. The state's security services, the FSB and its predecessor agencies, expanded their power. The KGB never disappeared after the Soviet collapse. It was renamed, reorganized, and ultimately reasserted itself as the dominant force in Russian politics. Putin, a former KGB colonel, brought many of his former colleagues into government. By 2008, when Putin stepped down as president due to term limits and became prime minister under Dmitry Medvedev, the pattern was clear. Russia had not become a democracy. It had become a new kind of autocracy, one that used the forms of democracy, elections, parties, a constitution, to mask a centralized, unaccountable system. Why does this still matter? The story of the Russian Empire and its revolutions does not end with the fall of the Soviet Union. It continues in the structures of power, the habits of governance, the attitudes of the people. The Russian state has cycled through periods of centralization and collapse, reform and reaction, expansion and contraction. The empire was overthrown by revolution. The revolution was corrupted by power. The Soviet Union was replaced by a chaotic democracy that gave way to a new authoritarianism. Each phase has left its mark. The memory of the Great Patriotic War, as World War II is called in Russia, still fuels a sense of national pride and grievance. The trauma of the 1990s still shapes political choices. The desire for order, for a strong leader who will protect the country from external enemies and internal chaos, remains powerful. In the 21st century, Russia has become a revisionist power. It has invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, interfered in elections in the United States and Europe, and supported authoritarian regimes around the world. These actions are not random. They are rooted in a historical narrative that sees Russia as a besieged fortress, a civilization under threat from the West. That narrative was forged in the fires of the Mongol invasion, the time of troubles, the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the two World Wars, and the Cold War. It was reinforced by the humiliation of the 1990s. It is a story that justifies repression at home and aggression abroad. The Russian Empire, with its czars and serfs, its grandeur and brutality, gave way to a revolution that promised liberation. That revolution gave way to a Soviet state that became a prison. The Soviet collapse gave way to a chaotic democracy that failed. And that failure gave way to a new authoritarianism that claims the mantle of history. The cycle is not inevitable, but it is deeply embedded in the institutions, the culture, and the collective memory of the Russian people. To understand why Putin is popular, why the war in Ukraine continues, why dissent is crushed, one must understand the long arc of Russian history. The revolution never ended. It simply took new forms. At 11 p.m. on the 31st of December 1999, a tired and ill Boris Yeltsin looked into a camera and told the Russian people he was stepping down. He apologized for his failures. He asked for forgiveness. Then he handed power to Vladimir Putin. That moment, quiet and unremarkable, was the last act of the 20th century's great Russian drama. The 21st century would be written by a different hand. The story of the Russian Empire, from Tsars to revolution, from revolution to superpower, from superpower to collapse, and from collapse to resurgence, is not finished. History, even when it seems to sleep, never really rests. On the 26th of March 2000, Vladimir Putin was elected president of the Russian Federation with nearly 53% of the vote in the first round. It was a decisive victory, but not a clean one. International observers noted irregularities. Media coverage was heavily skewed in his favor. The main opposition candidate, the communist Gennady Zyuganov, had little access to television. The outcome was never really in doubt. The election was the first sign that Russia's fragile democracy was being refashioned into something else. What happened next was a methodical consolidation of power. Putin moved quickly to bring the regional governors under federal control. The upper house of parliament, the Federation Council, was stripped of its independent authority. A new law made it easier to remove governors who fell out of favor. The oligarchs who had controlled the economy and media under Yeltsin were summoned to the Kremlin. Putin made them an offer: stay out of politics and keep your wealth. Those who refused were destroyed. Vladimir Gusinsky, the media magnate who owned NTV, was arrested on fraud charges. He fled the country. Boris Berezovsky, the kingmaker of the 1990s, was forced into exile. He was later found dead in London under suspicious circumstances in Tuzia Runa 3. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the richest man in Russia, was arrested in 2003 at gunpoint on a Siberian runway. He spent a decade in prison. His oil company, Yukos, was dismantled and its assets transferred to state-owned Rosneft. The message was unmistakable. The state was back in charge. But the restoration of state authority came with a dark echo of the Tsarist and Soviet past. The security services, known collectively as the Siloviki, expanded their influence throughout the government. Former KGB officers filled key posts in ministries, regional administrations, and state corporations. The FSB grew into a sprawling surveillance apparatus. Journalists who wrote critically about the Kremlin were threatened. In 2004, the independent news channel TVS was shut down. In 2006, Anna Politkovskaya was murdered. In 2009, the human rights lawyer Stanislav Markelov was gunned down in broad daylight. In 2015, the opposition politician Boris Nemtsov was killed on a bridge near the Kremlin. Each killing sent the same signal: dissent would not be tolerated. How could this have happened? The answer lies partly in the trauma of the 1990s. The chaos, poverty, and humiliation of that decade had left most Russians exhausted. They craved order, security, and national pride. Putin delivered that. The economy revived on the back of soaring oil and gas prices. Real wages grew, poverty halved. Russia paid off its foreign debt early. For the first time in years, the government had money to rebuild infrastructure, raise pensions, and project power abroad. In 2005, Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Many Russians agreed. The revival of national pride was genuine, and it was carefully managed by state-controlled media. The price of that stability was the hollowing out of democratic institutions. The courts became tools of the executive. The parliament became a rubber stamp. Elections became a formality. By 2008, when term limits forced Putin to step aside and become prime minister under Dmitry Medvedev, the system was already locked in place. Medvedev was a placeholder. Real power remained with Putin. In 2012, Putin returned to the presidency amid large protests in Moscow, the largest since the 1990s. The protests were met with a crackdown, new laws against unauthorized demonstrations, tighter control over the internet, and the reintroduction of charges like extremism and treason. The protest leaders were arrested, jailed, or driven into exile. Then came the foreign confrontations. In 2008, Russia went to war with Georgia over the breakaway region of South Ossetia. The war was short and decisive. Russian forces occupied Georgian territory for several months. The West condemned the action but did not intervene. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, a peninsula that had been part of Russia until 1954, when it was transferred to Ukraine by Soviet decree. The annexation was swift, bloodless, and widely popular inside Russia. A separatist war broke out in eastern Ukraine. Russia denied direct involvement, but the evidence was overwhelming. The West imposed sanctions. The Russian economy, already weakened by falling oil prices, went into recession. But the narrative inside Russia was different. The West was trying to strangle the country, and only a strong leader could resist. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The goal, according to Putin, was to denazify and demilitarize the country, to prevent NATO from expanding further east, and to protect the Russian-speaking population of the Donbass. The invasion did not go as planned. Ukrainian resistance was fierce and effective. The West supplied weapons, intelligence, and financial support. The war turned into a grinding, bloody conflict that has killed tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians. Russia has been pushed back in some areas but has continued to pound Ukrainian cities with missiles and drones. The war has reshaped the global order, rekindled NATO's purpose, and driven a wedge between Russia and the West that will take generations to heal. Why does this still matter? Because the patterns of Russian history are repeating. The centralization of power, the suppression of dissent, the reliance on force, the suspicion of the outside world, the sense of imperial mission, all of these are not new. They are the deep currents that have,